Time flies when you're having fun. Congratulations to Zach Gelb on his 1-year anniversary at Fox Sports 920 The Jersey. Now stop with all the sentimental and let's talk some sports. Now it's time for more of the Zach Gelb Show on Fox Sports 920 The Jersey.
All right, welcome back in to the Zach Gelb Show from the Princeton Orthopedic Associates Studios. 5:15 is the time right now, as it is the 1-year anniversary of the Zach Gelb Show. What a fun hour number one right here on Fox Sports 920 The Jersey. Seth Greenberg talking NBA draft, and then Sid Rosenberg joined the fun, and you never know where the conversation is going to go when Sid Rosenberg is on the show. But now an absolute legend in the sportscasting industry, Bob Costas, is going to join us. And Bob and myself, we went to the same high school, Comac High School. A little bit of a difference on the years. And also, Rosie O'Donnell also attended Comac High School. How about that? But the legendary sportscaster, Bob Costas, is gracious enough to take a few minutes out of his diligent schedule to join us right now. Bob, can't thank you enough. Thank you so much. And how are you?
Hey, Zach, most of us didn't think you'd survive a year, so it's in the upset category.
It is. This is a 16 seed beating a 1 seed, Bob.
Yeah, it's absolutely. It's almost like Princeton over Georgetown. But Princeton fell just short back in, what was it, 88 or 89? Before you were born, Zach.
Well, before I was even a thought. So we all have this moment, people that want to do this job, and some people think it's very easy, but when you actually do the job, you realize how tough it is and how much stuff needs to happen behind the scene. But growing up as a kid, I went into those WFAN studios with the access that I had. I grew up with Mike and the Mad Dog, falling asleep at night, listening to Bob Murphy on the radio, listening to Mets games. For you, when was that moment when you were a young kid that you fell in love with sports broadcasting?
Well, probably before I was 10 years old, because for me, the voices were inseparable from the events, and that was a golden age of New York broadcasting. Growing up on Long Island, you heard Marty Glickman calling Giants games and then Jets games. I can faintly remember Marty, who virtually invented how to call a basketball game on the radio, doing Knicks games, and then he was succeeded by the young Marv Albert, so you're listening to Marv. You're listening to Lindsey Nelson and Bob Murphy, and although Ralph Kiner wasn't a classic sportscaster, he certainly was a terrific storyteller and a Hall of Fame player. You're listening to him. I remember Mel Allen and Red Barber with the Yankees, although Barber's greatest fame was with the Brooklyn Dodgers. I don't remember that. I did live for a year and a half as a kid in Southern California, and I heard Vin Scully on the radio almost every night. And then on network television, you're watching people like Jim McKay and Jack Whitaker, and those are the people I gravitated toward, the people who had a little bit of a sense of the world beyond sports. Even though sports was an obsession for me like so many other kids, the guys who could fill in the little grace notes and the little shadings about time and place and make an historical reference, those are the guys who captured my imagination the most.
Would you imitate them as a kid when you were in your room with like a recorder?
Well, I'd try to imitate the cadences of broadcasters, but I wouldn't try to imitate their voices or anything like that. Even as a kid, that struck me as a bad idea because if you thought about it, if there were a dozen guys, and at that point it was only guys in the profession, someday people will be citing, if they don't already, women whose work they admire. But if there were a dozen guys then that you admired, they were each different. They were each distinct. That's part of the reason you admired them, because they were distinctive. Nobody thinks Vin Scully should sound like Harry Carey, or that Harry's one-time boothmate in St. Louis, Jack Buck, should have tried to emulate him, or the other way around. So it always struck me that while you could learn things about preparation or about approach or about pace, that to directly try to copy would be a bad idea.
When did you realize that you had a really bright future in this business, Bob?
When I found the incriminating photos of network executives at a retreat in the Philippines. After that, I pretty much had leverage.
Come on, like, what was that serious first moment that you thought, okay, I know that I'm really good at this?
Well, you're never as good as you would like to be. And
Sure.
I think no matter who you think is the best who's ever done it, that person will tell you that they never had a perfect broadcast, that they always walked away thinking, well, that was pretty good, but I could have done this, or in retrospect, I should have said that. So you never want to be too self-satisfied. about it. But when I came to NBC, I'd done a little bit of work in the 70s at CBS when I was 24, 25, 26 years old. When I came to NBC, it was primarily as a play-by-play man, and I was pretty good at that. Football games, basketball games, and then some of the backup baseball games in the early 80s when the number one team was Joe Garagiola and Tony Kubek. But after Bryant Gumbel went to the Today Show, Mike Weissman and Don Ohlmeyer, who were running things at NBC Sports, just plucked me out of nowhere to fill in on hosting duties. And not only had I never done anything like that before, but I had never even seen a teleprompter before. And for the first 5 years that I hosted the NFL or any programs like that, I never used a teleprompter. The first time I ever used one was at the Olympics in Seoul in 1988 because I wasn't used to it. And when I was able to handle that in 1984, 85, 86, and not only do it pretty well but have fun doing it with Ahmad Rashad and Paul McGuire and the late, great Frank DeFord, people like that. And when those programs were well received, then I began to feel more and more comfortable. And on top of that, I think, oddly, when David Letterman, who came on the air at NBC in 1982 following Johnny Carson, when David Letterman started using me and Marv Albert in sketches where you do this kind of deadpan stuff and sort of a satire of what a sportscaster would do in absurd situations. And when that was well received, that helped me to feel more comfortable as well. And then just getting back to the teleprompter thing, since I do a lot of hosting, more hosting actually than play-by-play in recent years, what I think I've been able to do is most of the time people can't tell if I'm reading the teleprompter or I'm ad-libbing because I don't like to be locked into a script. I like to be able to throw things in parenthetically or go off if something occurs to me and then come back to the script. And I think when you're able to feel comfortable enough to do that, then you're able to say to yourself that at least I belong here.
You also got to thank Goldie Goldthorpe that he didn't beat you up that day, or else you wouldn't have had a future, right?
Yeah, my very first job was broadcasting minor league hockey in the Slapshot League, the actual league that the Paul Newman movie Slapshot was based on, the old Eastern Hockey League. I got paid $30 a game to broadcast in such exotic outposts as Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and Lewiston, Maine, and at the Syracuse War Memorial. And I was still a senior at Syracuse while I was doing that, trying to finish up my degree, but pursue this professional opportunity as well. And if you've ever seen Slapshot, there's a character named Ogie Oglethorpe who is based 100% on Bill Harpo Goldthorpe, who played for the Syracuse Blazers and was an enforcer on steroids. I don't mean he was actually on steroids. I mean the idea of being an enforcer taken to the 10th power. And he would fight anything that moved or anything that annoyed him. And my mere presence annoyed him because I was reading the New York Times on the bus, and that just infuriated Goldie because anything other than the hockey news was outside his frame of reference. So he ripped the New York Times out of my hands while a bus is making its way down the thruway to Johnstown or some such place, and he ripped it to shreds and let the shreds drop onto the floor of the bus, or the aisle of the bus. And I'm 21 years old, and I'm thinking, well, I can't let this stand. I got to do something. And I looked up at him and I said, Goldie, don't be jealous. I'll teach you to read. And that did not improve my situation at all because it only infuriated him all the more. And he did threaten mayhem, but some of his teammates stepped in, and as they say, cooler heads prevailed because I didn't like my chances if I had to go one-on-one with him.
Bob Costas with us right now on the Zach Gelb Show, Fox Sports 920 The Jersey. You look at your career, and you have more accolades than anyone. It's Emmy after Emmy, and deservingly so. After doing it for all these years and continuing to do it, what are you most proud of after all these years, Bob?
The versatility, I think. I was able to do a wide variety of things, both in and out of sports, and do them reasonably well. And the appreciation of reasonable people. You know, we live in a culture now where anybody can say anything about anybody. It doesn't have to even make sense, let alone be fair or true. But I think the consensus over the years among reasonable, fair-minded, informed people is that while nobody is perfect, that I've generally done a good job in a variety of different assignments.
And you look at some of the events that you've done, and we could sit here all day and talk about them, the Olympics, Super Bowls, World Series, NBA Finals, the list just goes on and on and on. Is there anything that you haven't done in your career that you wish to still do, or have you done everything at this point?
Well, I've been asked that question before. Dan Patrick likes to ask me that question, so you're in good company. And the answer I give, I guess it's a stock answer, is that I think almost every sports broadcaster would like to put a check next to the Masters just because it's such a distinctive event. But A, it's always been on CBS. B, although I've done a little bit of golf in my NBC career, it's certainly not something that I'm deeply involved in or that I'm identified with, so I have no real claim on doing it. So it's a check that I'm not going to be able to put on the bucket list. But I guess the Masters would be one. It's such a beautiful setting, and it has so much history. Not all of it good, but a lot of it glorious. So that's one, I guess, that I'll never get to say I did.
Is there an interview currently, whether it's an athlete, a commissioner, an executive, that you want to interview right now?
Well, we have the Super Bowl coming up in February of 2018, and I'll be hosting the Super Bowl, even though I'm not going to do Sunday Night Football on a regular basis any longer. But I will do the Super Bowl because Mike Tirico, who's succeeding me on the Olympics, will have to be in Korea because the Winter Olympics in South Korea begin just 5 days after the Super Bowl. So he'll be there preparing, and I'll be hosting the Super Bowl. You don't know who's going to be in the game, but you do know there are always issues surrounding the NFL, not just every season, but ongoing issues. So I would love, although I've done it before, I would love to have a new and updated, extensive interview with Roger Goodell at the Super Bowl. We'll see if it happens.
And I know the biggest part of an interview is you always have to listen, especially when you get an interview that big, and there's so many things Goodell could say that you could follow up on. But if you had to bring up two things to Goodell, you get two questions to Goodell. What are your two questions?
Well, one has to be the basic nature of the game. Let's stipulate all the reasons why people like the NFL, why they follow it, how many good people, past and present, have been involved in the National Football League as players, as coaches. Let's take all that as a given. There's still something about the nature of the game which leads the league itself to now acknowledge, this is the league's own estimate, that between 25 and 30% of players who play football long enough to have played it for several years in the NFL, and that presumes they played in high school and college before they get to the pros, between 25 and 30% of them will suffer some sort of neurological damage, some sort of brain damage from having played football. That isn't sort of a peripheral issue. That's a central issue. So that would be one for sure. Franchise relocations are always a question. I guess, if it hasn't been resolved and he hasn't really spoken about it publicly, even though the case is now closed, I guess, if he hasn't really given a satisfactory explanation, you could always talk about Deflategate again and what his thinking was there, and if he regrets it in retrospect, because the reputation of one of the greatest players in the league's history, I think, unnecessarily took a hit through a process in which a misdemeanor was somehow elevated, at least in the league's eyes, to a felony, if it even was a misdemeanor, which it probably was, but nothing more than that. Those would be a few of the things, but I haven't begun to prepare for the interview yet, Zach. When I get a chance to think about it, I'll have 4, 5, and 6 for you.
You got it. One other thing that I'm just curious about is domestic abuse
yes,
in the
that
National
would have
Football
to be
League.
one. You're right, Zach. That would have to be one.
Bob Costas with us right now, wrapping up with the legendary sportscaster. Let's shift the conversation to a little baseball, because what's happening in New York right now is very special with the Yankees, with Aaron Judge. How about a little bit on Judge, and also how much do you think their success is sustainable over the course of the remaining games in the regular season?
Well, this isn't going to be a profound insight, but it will depend on their starting pitching. CC to the disabled list now. He had been doing pretty well. The depth of the starting pitching is a question. Tanaka's a gigantic question mark. They thought he was their number one. Once they get Chapman back, they've got a lockdown bullpen. They're not going to lose many games where they have the lead in the 7th inning or later. And their lineup is truly an impressive lineup. And Aaron Judge isn't just good. He has that it factor. He captures people's imagination. Nobody changes the channel when it's his turn at bat. Nobody goes to the concession stand if they're at the ballpark, if it's an inning in which he might come to bat. He might do something not just excellent, but spectacular and unforgettable at any given moment. And because people are so focused, especially if they're just watching highlight shows, on his tape measure home runs, I think people outside New York may not realize what an excellent fielder and good base runner he is. So he has a chance to be an MVP-type contender for a long, long time, a Triple Crown contender perhaps, in several seasons of what could be an epic career.
Going off that, and that's what's so neat about this, because so many kids now in New York and this unexpected success of Aaron Judge are now buying his jersey, and they're becoming, those kids, they're having Aaron Judge be their favorite player in the game right now. When you were growing up, Mickey Mantle was that godlike figure, and I'm not saying Judge is Mantle, because right now that would just be so silly on my part, but you and Mickey were very close. You read the eulogy at his funeral. Just how did you guys become so close over all those years?
Well, one of my first broadcast partners was his old Yankee teammate, Tony Kubek. Tony and I did games on NBC on the Saturday game of the week in the 80s. And so Tony introduced me to Mickey. And Mickey and I, for some reason, hit it off. And we often crossed paths in New York. And we had dinner together several times. And I remembered a lot about his career, and he seemed to enjoy my company and vice versa. And then when he passed away, his family asked me to do the eulogy, which was a great honor. And I guess because I had lived it, I knew what it was like to be a kid who loved baseball and how baseball was different in the 50s and 60s. Not better. I think overall the players are clearly better now. But there was a romance that surrounded the game in the 50s and 60s, and times changed, and it isn't quite the same. But I understood the era. I understood how people felt, not just about Mickey Mantle, but how if you grew up in Detroit, you would have felt about Al Kaline. Or if you grew up in Chicago, you might have felt about Ernie Banks. Or if you grew up at the right time in New York, how you felt about the young Willie Mays. Or out in the Bay Area, how you felt about Willie Mays when he got there with the Giants. I understood that feeling, and I was able, I guess, to express it in a way that resonated with people, and I think that just kind of solidified my connection in people's minds with Mickey Mantle.
How does the MLB speed up the game and make this more exciting to the younger kids right now, Bob?
The pace of game thing is really a problem, and part of the problem is that what works strategically does not work from an entertainment standpoint. Almost all managers and almost all general managers believe that the best strategic approach is to hope that, except that the guy's Max Scherzer or somebody like that, or Clayton Kershaw, that you're looking for 6 innings out of your starter, and then you're going to bring a procession of relievers in, and you see 3-1 games in which each team has used 5 pitchers. And those constant changes, plus the fact that so many of these pitchers throw very, very hard, and they can let the throttle out because they're only coming in for an inning or maybe for a batter or 2. The number of strikeouts is at an all-time high. The number of walks is also up. They talk about the true outcomes, home runs, strikeouts, walks. Well, home runs are exciting. Strikeouts and walks, not so much, and strikeouts and walks take longer. Now, this is a random statistic. In and of itself, it doesn't prove anything, but I think it's interesting. One of the most celebrated games in baseball history was Game 7 of the 1960 World Series between the Pirates and the Yankees. The final score was 10-9. The Pirates won it on a home run in the bottom of the 9th by Bill Mazeroski. 10-9. The game took about 2.5 hours, give or take a minute or two, and there was not a single strikeout on either side in the entire game. Well, that does tend to move things along, even when 19 runs are scored.
Wow. That's a fascinating story. Wrapping up with Bob Costas, who joins us right now. I want to get to one more thing, just because it's been a big debate on our show and a lot of shows recently. We had Pete Rose on a few weeks ago, and he says he doesn't care about the Hall of Fame anymore, and I just don't believe that. And we had on Reggie Jackson, and we were talking about steroids in the Hall of Fame as well. With Pete, I know they're two separate issues, but with Pete not being in the Hall of Fame and some of the steroid guys, where do you fall on those two issues?
I think Pete is perhaps a separate issue, but I've said this from the very start. Baseball needlessly complicated it. They should have separated the Hall of Fame from being banned from baseball. And then the Hall of Fame itself put in a rule the year that Pete Rose would have been eligible that said any player on the permanently ineligible list cannot be on the Hall of Fame ballot. Well, clearly that ruling wasn't aimed at Shoeless Joe Jackson, who had died in 1950 and had been on the ballot for a little while when the Hall of Fame first came into existence. It was aimed at Pete Rose and Pete Rose alone, and it created a needless, ongoing controversy for baseball. Pete Rose should have been on the Hall of Fame ballot from the early 90s on, while still being banned from baseball. There were good reasons for both those things to be the case, and now it's just a muddle.
And then with the steroid guys, what's going to end up happening with this? Because I know it's a case-by-case basis, and some guys are going to get in, some guys aren't. But I still feel like whether you want to put something on their plaque or not, that we still have to honor these great players. Even though we know they didn't do it the clean way, I feel still like they have to be in the Hall of Fame.
I think what's going to happen is that there's going to be a higher bar in the minds of most voters for people that they either know or suspect were involved in steroids. But that bar is not going to be so high that it can't be cleared. So if somebody is right on the bubble, and if they're associated with steroids, I think they're not going to get in. But if they have overwhelming statistics, Clemens and Bonds, for example, are going to be a litmus test. They moved up significantly in last year's voting into the 50% plus 50% range, and they still have 5 years left on the ballot to get to 75. If Bonds and Clemens get in, then it's going to change how people look at others who have substantial credentials. If you're right on the bubble, they're going to penalize you for it enough to keep you out. But if you've got overwhelming numbers, and if Bonds and Clemens are already in, then you're going to see a lot of other steroid guys get in. However, there are other arguments to be made. Some people will say, well, I'm going to vote for Barry Bonds, but I'm not going to vote for A-Rod because A-Rod was nailed twice after punishments and testing were in place. So I put him in a different category. Will everybody view it that way? No, but some people will. Some people will look at Mark McGwire on a Veterans Committee and say, you know what? McGwire really would have had a decent chance to be a Hall of Famer. Not a Willie Mays, Hank Aaron type Hall of Famer, but maybe a Harmon Killebrew type Hall of Famer, even if he hadn't done steroids. On the other hand, we don't think, and now you're asking voters to play pharmacologist or whatever, but we don't think Sammy Sosa would have been anything like what Sammy Sosa was without steroids because he had no indication of that in the first several years of his career until he obviously began juicing. So they're going to make a distinction between Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa. So I guess the short answer at the back end of this long answer is it's going to be a mixed bag. Are steroid guys already in? Yes. Will more steroid guys get in? Yes. And once Bonds and Clemens get in, it'll be easier to vote for even more of them. But there will still be some distinctions made among them, I think.
Doesn't a guy, though, like Sosa have to get in just because of the numbers? Like
No.
But that's the thing that I still have a hard time wrapping my head around. Because he still put up those numbers. Did he do it clean? No, but he still put up those numbers.
Well, yeah, he put up those numbers. So if I walk into the room on stilts and I declare, yes, I'm on stilts, but I'm still the tallest guy in the room, am I really the tallest guy in the room?
I think that's a little bit different, though, Bob.
Look, the guy never did anything even approaching all-star level, let alone Hall of Fame level. And when people say, here's one of the all-time illogical arguments, you know, pitchers juiced, hitters juiced, so it's kind of a wash.
Well, that's stupid, yeah.
Okay,
you're right.
It's ridiculous. It's so stupid. Because then you're saying that if no pitchers juiced and no hitters juiced, then Sammy Sosa would have hit 60 homers 3 times. How is it that all of the 60 homer seasons, outside of Babe Ruth in an entirely different time, and Roger Maris in a perfect storm, expansion year, Mickey Mantle hitting behind him, Roger never getting a single intentional pass all year long, Mantle hitting 54 home runs, which he was certainly naturally capable of when reasonably healthy, and Roger hitting those 61 homers in 590 times at bat. So it's nothing near the home run rate of steroid guys like Sosa and Bonds and McGwire. How is it possible that those numbers, those mega numbers, those cartoon numbers, were only put up in that 5 to 6 year stretch?
Well, it's because of steroids.
Yeah.
I get that, but still, to me, it's like vacating wins in college sports. I just think that's silly to do. The point I'm making is it happened. Let's acknowledge it happened, and I still think you have to put these guys in. And I know that they're a different player than some of the all-time great players that did it pure, but a guy like Sosa, it happened, and therefore isn't it a Hall of Fame to put great players in?
Well, some people would say he wasn't a truly and genuinely and authentically great player. Whereas A-Rod was, no question, a great player without it. Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, great players without it. Mark McGwire, arguably, great player without it. Sosa, maybe not so much. Now let's think about Manny Ramirez. You could put him in a different category. One of the great right-handed hitters that any of us has ever seen. On the other hand, an indifferent outfielder, a terrible base runner, twice quit on his own team, and was twice caught for performance-enhancing drugs, twice suspended when the thing had been codified, when the testing was in place, when specific punishments were in place. That puts him in a somewhat different category. Does that mean he doesn't get in? Not necessarily. But does that mean that there's a different set of facts to consider? I think so.
Hey, Bob, we appreciate it. We could talk with you all day. We appreciate it so much. Thanks so much.
All right, Zach, congrats on your anniversary.
Thank you so much. I can't believe it either, Bob.
Most of us can't. See ya.
Bob Costas with us right now on the Zach Gelb Show, Fox Sports 920 The Jersey. I'll tell you, the first time we do so many interviews, very rarely do I ever get nervous for an interview. But I was in freshman year of college at Temple, and I somehow got Bob to come on our show. And I was promoting the crap out of this interview everywhere, all over the place. We're having on Bob Costas, going to be the biggest and best thing. And I'm sitting there getting ready to pre-record the interview, as nervous as could be. And I went back and listened to it. I wasn't terrible. I was just stiff. My personality, it took a few questions to come on out and really get into the interview and get into a flow. And something happened with the schedule that he had to call in 20 minutes late. And during those 20 minutes, it was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Because I'm sitting there in the little closet at WHIP in the production room. And I'm thinking to myself, we just promoted this interview. What happens if he doesn't call in? Because we had to play it later in the day. And then he called in and I go, woof. But it's always fun to talk to Bob Costas. Here's my point with the Hall of Fame. And this is what annoys me. These players, we all know Sosa cheated. We all know Bonds cheated. We all know Clemens cheated. And some players like a Bonds would have got in the Hall of Fame with the drugs or not. Sosa, probably not. But these things still happened. And the Hall of Fame to me is a museum that explains the history of the game. And I'm not going to compare Sosa to a Hank Aaron in terms of the home runs that they hit, because that would be foolish, because one person did it in a clean way and the other didn't. But put something on the plaque, because I can't ignore greatness. And Sammy Sosa, when I watched Sammy Sosa, I thought great baseball player. When I watched Mark McGwire, I thought great baseball player. And those guys that hit prodigious home runs and were great players, whether you like them or not, is a different thing. But they have to be in the Hall of Fame because they still hit 600-something home runs. How do you not put a player in that hit 600-something home runs? It makes no sense to me. And that's why they have to be put in. Now, you don't have to applaud them when they're in Cooperstown. You don't have to do that. But they need to be in Cooperstown. And I get it. People will call in and will say, hey, Zach, if you go to the Hall of Fame, and I know Pete Rose is a different thing. Pete Rose should be in. He's the all-time hit king. But those guys should still be in. Now, Pete Rose did something terrible. He broke the number one rule in baseball. He gambled. But he should still be in because he's the hit king. But with the steroid guys, yeah, there's mentions of them in the Hall of Fame. So you could tell me, oh, well, they tell you the history that way. But in that plaque section, they're not there. And the plaque section is to tell the history of the great players. And you don't need to put Sosa and McGwire on the same level as a Mantle, as a Hank Aaron, as a Babe Ruth. But they still need to fall somewhere in the pecking order of greatness, and greatness gets in the Hall of Fame. And those guys produce those numbers. Now, they didn't do it clean. People could have stopped it, but they didn't. And they still produced those numbers. It's like going back to the Louisville situation, and it was disgusting and despicable that went on at Louisville. But that banner shouldn't come down. Because even though illegal things happened at the university, those things still occurred on the field. And I'm someone that bashes Penn State the most. What happened at Penn State was disgusting. But initially, I know it's changed over time. Initially, when those penalties came out and they took away some of Paterno's wins, I thought that was foolish. Because if an event happens, why are you trying to erase it from my memory? Sammy Sosa hit a lot of home runs. He wasn't clean. The public opinion will tell you that. And you'll know when he goes into the Hall of Fame, which I don't think he will, but if he did, people will know that he didn't do it the right way. But what he did on the field was still greatness. And the Hall of Fame's not for the very good. It's for great. And he didn't go about it the right way, but he still needs to be in the Hall of Fame. And that's why I got to the point where I put, and I told Pete Rose this when he was on the show agreeing with me, I would put Bonds in, I would put Clemens in, I would put Sosa in, I would put McGuire in, I would put Palmeiro in, and some of those guys, McGuire, Palmeiro, and Sosa, they embarrassed baseball at that Congress hearing. They did. That was a joke. But they still need to be in the Hall of Fame. And I don't like them, but when I watched them played, and when I saw Sosa played, I said, wow, he's a great player. And that's the key word, great. Great players need to be in the Hall of Fame. They didn't do it clean. We know that. But when they played the game, did you say, were they great players? Yes. And then you learn more, and that changed your opinion. But what we saw during their playing careers, we saw greatness. And great players, like I said, for the 9,000th time in the last 2 minutes, need to be in the Hall of Fame. 6099199D200. But what a thrill. Bob Costas on the show. He went to the same high school as me. Like I said, a little bit different in the years. Rosie O'Donnell also went to my high school. And the fascinating thing about that is I won a communications award when I graduated high school over, over 5 years ago? Something like that? Whatever it was. I got the communications award. And when they gave me the communications award, it just says, Comac High School Excellence in Communication. I love my alma mater in Comac High School, but how isn't that the Bob Costas Award? How isn't that the Rosie O'Donnell Award? And you know what, throw Rosie out of this. How isn't that the Bob Costas Award? And I actually met Rosie O'Donnell once at the Super Bowl. We took a picture, and I said, Comac's finest, and people had all these comments.